Okay, templates, definition, everybody needs the same language, and of course, we need some tools. And I will show you some simple Excel tools which help you to do risk management
Mm.
in the end.
And now that we've seen these 8 or 9 items here, let's just make it absolutely clear to the viewers here. Until now, we haven't really done any risk management per se. We haven't actively done anything. We've really just sat down and we thought about all of these. What are our strategies? What are our templates? What is our communications plan? What are the success criteria and thresholds that we have? That's all that we've defined. We have done nothing but planning. We have
It's
just
just the
written this
answer,
stuff down.
it's just the answer to the question how do we want to do it? And the result with also all these aspects is a so-called risk management plan.
Exactly. And now, once we know all of this, now we can get into the other processes of risk management, and that one begins with risk identification. This is where we go in and we sit down and we do some brainstorming and we think, okay, what risks do we have, right?
Exactly. This process is done really often in contrast to the planned risk management process we discussed before. The meta process is only done once. And here we want to identify risks as early as possible. So before you start the project, you already have to ask your project sponsor what risks he might see. And you have to do a lot of talking to people, and you will find out what their opinion is, and you can come up with your first list of risks. And of course, you have to identify risks anytime. I think it's a good practice, and I do it all the time. If I have a project team meeting, after the official agenda, I ask all the participants, what new risks do you see? Have risks changed, or is anything else coming up? Do we have opportunities which we should use? And if you make it a habit to ask this question every time, it's a good starting point for risk management.
Okay. Once we have them identified, there are two processes that everybody always messes up and doesn't really know which one is which. I'm one of these people. It's the qualitative risk analysis and the quantitative risk analysis. Let's look at the qualitative risk analysis first. What's happening here?
Um, yeah, you don't miss them up if you remember the word quality. And with quality, it's always how bad is it? So you don't confuse it afterwards.
Right.
So the main aspects of the qualitative analysis is impact. So how do I measure the impact? And that's financial impact. Robert Courtney Jr. from IBM came up with a formula in 1970, and he said, multiply the financial impact and the probability that the risk occurs, and you have your priority. It's
Yes.
perfect.
Yeah.
It has ever been used since. Of course, if you have a company or an organization which needs another metric instead of the financial impact, change it. But you always need to come up with a formula which is valid for all risks in your
Yeah.
organization.
And impact and probability is usually the one that is most often used.
Right.
Right.
What else do we need? What people usually forget, you need a risk owner because the project manager is not the technical guy. For example, I did a lot of software development, but today I don't dare to be a risk owner because there are the software developers which know exactly about their risks, and I choose risks owner from the team who is accountable for the risks. Of course, you cannot ask everybody. A risk owner needs a lot of experience, and some risks will go to the project sponsor. You have to find the right person who makes managing the risks a really personal task. Because if you fail and you have a risk which occurs, you have a great problem.
Hmm. You also
And
have the risk action owner here.
yeah, I was uh, very curious when I found that term in the new practice standard because you usually only get the risk owner.
Yeah.
The risk action owner is responsible uh, for implementing a risk response in time. So it's kind of response owner. And the risk owner is the guy who is really accountable for the overall risk. And if you have a risk owner for every very little risk, that's not good. So you should choose for which risks you have an owner and an action owner. And that also implies that you should drop very simple risks and focus on the big risks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you said the easiest way to remember the qualitative risk analysis is to ask yourself, how bad is it? So what's the simple question you ask yourself to remember what the quantitative risk analysis does?
Quantity is a question of how much.
Uh-huh.
I always think of mathematics and formulas, and that's what it is about. In qualitative risk analysis, the process we discussed before, you look at one risk at a time. In quantitative, the second process, risk analysis, you look at all risks at the same time, and that's very complex. And why do you do it? You want to find out what is the probability of achieving the project goals when you look at all the risks at the same time, because the risks are not nice and they do not occur one after another. You always have a situation where many risks can occur at the same time and they interact and they are dependent on each other. And you have to find out what the root causes are. And there are mathematical approaches like the Monte Carlo analysis, which allows you to do that. Of course, that's a very big gun. So you just don't do it for small projects. And it's another of the success factors of risk management. We have to scale it to your project. So this project is this process is the first one which you drop if your project is smaller. So what other questions does this process answer? It asks the question, does the reserve meet the risk tolerance? So each organization has its own risk tolerance, and you need to provide enough reserves to manage the risks that people feel safe enough. That's a simple way to describe it. Another thing which is important is to find out which parts of the project makes the biggest problems. So maybe you want to approach them in another way. Maybe you want to change the scope. If you know in advance where all the problems come from and all the risks come from, that's a great help to verify that your approach is the right one. And of course, you want to know which are the biggest risks. So it's a very complex process, and it's not for people which do small projects and which do not have the right software and models at hand.
Okay. So the first four processes we looked at so far, the first one was plan risk management, that we just planned, right? Then we identified the risks, and then we went through the qualitative risk analysis and the quantitative risk analysis. That means now we know what are our risks. What's next?
Now we know how bad it is.
Yeah, we know how bad it is and how much the risks are going to affect us.
Yeah,
what's
and
next?
Now the question, what do we do with it?
Mm-hmm.
So we plan risk responses. So the most interesting thing about planning risk responses are the strategies. What do I do with my risk? One possibility is to avoid them. I can change technology, I can change the approach to the project, for example, so that the issue just goes away. Another possibility is to transfer the risk. I can, for example, ask a supplier to take the risk. So it's out of my domain, and perhaps the supplier is just suited better to handle the risk.
Yeah, but let's make absolutely clear, when you transfer a risk, the risk still exists. The risk is still here. The risk can still affect your project, but it's someone else's problem.
Yeah, but perhaps it's not related to my core capabilities in my organization, and I give it to somebody who is experienced in handling such risks. Okay. For example, you just pay for an insurance in many cases to transfer risk. Mm-hmm. It's part of your daily life.
Yep.
So another way is to mitigate risk. I've tried to find a way to reduce the risk For example, I can ensure that people have more time or more budget to do some work better or in a little different way. But when you use mitigation, the risk doesn't go away. It's just reduced. Maybe the probability is lower, maybe the impact is lower, whatever. The important thing is you have to write down how you want to mitigate it. If you don't write down everything about your risk responses, you cannot evaluate what the effect will be. So when we look at the templates later, we will have a risk assessment before risk responses and after risk responses. So there's a fourth strategy. It's acceptance. We say, okay, there's a risk. It's too expensive or it takes too much time to do anything about it. And so we say we accept it. Or for example, we do not have enough time to do anything about it because the project has to be released on target date, and then you can choose that strategy. And of course, we are always talking about risks, and it's all about opportunities too. So we can improve opportunities, and you just need to change the word to apply the same for strategies to opportunities.
Right. And let's get back to my iPad example from earlier on.
Okay.
The most important thing here is in terms of an opportunity, oh, we might be able to sell, 3 times as many as we had expected. Oh, great, let's accept that. Not enough, because the question now suddenly is, well, if we have to sell 3 times as many, that means we also have to manufacture 3 times as many. Yeah? Can our manufacturing plant handle that kind of a demand, or do we have to reach out to other manufacturers and help us produce these more? So every risk that you have, every opportunity you have, you really have to look at these things in detail and say, this is what we do if the risk, if the opportunity actually occurs. But there's more to plan risk responses, right?
Yes, there are two very important terms. There are the so-called residual risks. We talked about risk mitigation. If you mitigate a risk, it becomes kind of smaller. And the remaining risk is called residual risk. It's the remainder. And the other type of risks which you should always be able to talk about are secondary risks. These are new risks, and they occur because you implement a risk response, because nearly everything which you do leads to new risks. And these are the so-called secondary risks, and you should always be able to distinguish them, and everybody should know the same language, the same words, so that there's no confusion. Because if there's confusion, then you have a bad plan. And it's not very good if you find out about a bad plan when a risk occurs. When a risk occurs, you just implement one of the plans you have available. You don't think too much, you act. So this is how to plan the action when you respond to a risk.
Right. But you mentioned earlier on that risk identification is something that is ongoing, and there's another process that's ongoing and that happens all the time in your risk management activities, and that is monitor and controlling of risk.
Yeah, it's a kind of umbrella process. Except the meta process where you create your risk management plan, your approach, how you want to do it. All these other projects occur all of the time. And for example, if I manage a project, I look at, on my risk list at least once a day, just to keep in mind what risks are there and to ensure that I don't forget anything. And sometimes it's a good idea to keep it in memory. And if you meet somebody from your project team, you just talk to them about risk and you learn something new.
So what exactly is it that you do when you look at your risk list every day? Is it do you do the standard processes that you do? You start out here with control all types of risks. Is that something that you keep in mind as you look at this list every day?
No, what I do is information correlation.
Ah,
try to remember everything which I learned from discussions, from meetings, from emails, whatever documents, and I relate it to the risk list and see, does this produce some new information? Should I talk to somebody about that new information? Does it give me a new way to handle the risk? I just correlate. And if there's nothing new, okay. But a lot of days there's some new information, and I take that new information when I talk to somebody. And so it goes round and round and round. I get information, I correlate, I give out information. And uh, regarding, it's depending on the situation, you have to call a meeting to discuss risks. You can have a risk identification workshop, and if the probability of a very dangerous risk of occurring is getting higher, then maybe it's good to have a stand-up meeting even several times a day. So
Right.
let's come to the monitor and control risks process. Yes, you have to control all types of risks so that you don't lose touch with anything. Then you need to identify new risk all of the time. If somebody tells you something which might be a risk and he doesn't realize it, ask him, do you think that's a risk? And probably he says yes. And then you say, okay,
Let's put it into the risk register.
yes, and let's talk about it. What might be a financial impact? Which are the other people we have to talk to understand the impact, to understand the probability? And of course, you need to ensure that the risk responses are done at the right time. If you wait too long, and that's always one of these delusion problems, you get into very bad situations. And I had a project, it had a remaining 3 weeks. The overall time was 2.5 months. So it was quite well into the implementation phase, and we found out we cannot do it in time. We need an incredible amount of time to finish it.
Hmm.
And so we escalated to management. But management took several weeks to decide what to do. That's the important thing about risk
That's
response.
what you mean about timely response, right?
Yes, you need to have an approved plan in advance. If you start from scratch a short time before the risk occurs, you can't manage it and you will fail. You will fail miserably. So plan it in advance, and I think it's one of the most important things in a project manager's mindset. He has to see risks everywhere. He has to, uh, these projects have to be hardwired in his brain because looking into the future, expecting the unexpected, that is real value to a project and to a project sponsor. You need to be a kind of, yeah, not maniac. You need to be paranoid. That's it.
Obsessive compulsive.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
that's it.
But don't talk in that way all the time.
Yeah, that would be bad. That would
Sometimes
be annoying
might
to
think
people.
you're not the right guy for the job, but for your inner world of feelings, it's very important.
Okay, you have two more items here on the monitor and control risks. The first one is ensure effective risk responses. That means that when management comes back to you and tells you what you need to do, then the risk response has to have an actual effect on the risk that you're worried about.
And the biggest problem always you need to measure if you are effective,
Yes.
because if you can't measure it, it's nothing. So you need to define the metrics in advance.
Hmm.
That may not work perfect when you start risk management, but you will grow. And by using continuous improvement, you will get better and better.
Right. Also, the last one that you have here is ensure effective risk management. I suppose that is overall, right? And that the same, I assume the same rule goes for this as well. You have to be able to measure whether your risk management on the project overall is effective, right?
Yes, put your metrics in your risk management plan so that you measure the same way in all projects and so that you can compare them. And basically, you need to measure on all layers. So these were the PMI-based risk management processes, and you will find the same processes everywhere. They may have different names, or there may be one process less or one process more, or the focus may be different, but basically it's always the same. Have a plan how to do it, find out what the risks are, find out how important the risks are, plan how to act, and check that it works. It's kind of a variant of the Deming circle.